Right, hello there everyone, and welcome to the next video that I've put together, or putting together as we speak to you, on how to answer a 10-mark exam question. So the question that we've got here is, with reference to figure 3, assess the likely impact of the change in the value of exports since mid-2016 on the economic growth of the UK. Use an aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram in your answer. Now, we've been doing a lot of work on how to answer 10 markers. And what I want you to remember is that for these types of questions, I'll highlight it in yellow here, these are the marks available for the different skills. So when you go into those exams, you should be thinking 10 markers, 2, 2, 2, 4. 2 for knowledge, 2 for application, 2 for analysis, and then 4 for evaluation. Okay, now on this question then, I'd expect to see 2 detailed paragraphs. And paragraph 1 will be covering knowledge, application and analysis. And I would grade it from level 1 to level 3. So level 1 would be a very basic answer. So you might show some good understanding about what exports are. You might be able to tell me how exports could influence economic growth. Level 2 would be drawing an accurate diagram showing the impacts of the changing exports. There might be some reference to what's happened to exports from the extracts. And then analysis will be, why will this changing exports affect economic growth, with a detailed chain of explanation. So level 1, level 2, level 3. Paragraph 2 is the final 4 marks, and we're looking here for the evaluation. And I would score this between level 1 and level 2. Level 1 would be an unsubstantiated judgment. So you might come with a really good evaluative statement linked to the question, but it might not actually be justified. So a top level 2 evaluation will be able to use the extract to form a judgment or give balance to their answer. So for example, if exports have increased, you might talk about in paragraph 1 why a growth in exports would lead to an increase in GDP and therefore create economic growth. In paragraph 2, what you could be thinking about is, well, to what extent will it raise economic growth? Will it have a big impact on economic growth? Will it have a small impact on economic growth? Will it create a short-run impact on economic growth and or a long-run impact on economic growth? Okay, so now we know roughly what we're doing on this question. It does say you've got to use figure 3. Now, you haven't got figure 3 on the screen, but you've got an extract, which is quite useful. What I'd like you to do, please, is to read the first paragraph of this extract. Don't worry about the second one. So what I recommend you do, you hit pause and you read that first paragraph. When you've read that paragraph, hit play again and we'll look at figure 3. So hit pause now and read that first paragraph, please. Right, everyone, welcome back. Hopefully you've now read that first paragraph. What I now want to show you is this. Okay, so the question's about what has happened to exports since mid-2016. So being able to read and interpret economic data is obviously a critical part of the course. Now, this orange line shows that in mid-2016, exports were roughly about £49 billion. And then what they do is at the end, in roughly February or March 2017, they grow to roughly about £50 billion per month. And then they fall ever so slightly, but they're still well above £49.5 billion per month. So we've got roughly about a £4.5 billion growth in exports across that time period per month. So if I multiply that by 12, I can work out roughly how much higher exports were due to that growth in exports. So I could do that £4.5 billion extra per month multiplied by the 12 months in the year, and that will give me £53.5 billion extra per year will go towards UK GDP due to that growth in exports. Now, just to put into context, the UK economy is roughly £2 trillion per year. So that 53.5% growth in exports is probably going to be roughly about a 2.5% growth in GDP. Well, that could potentially be quite a significant impact on UK GDP. But anyway, let's now look at the question again and start to think about the answer. Now, before we start giving an answer, I think what is useful is to understand why exports have increased by this roughly £4.5 billion per month. So let me just change that on here. I put 4, but really we should put about £4.5 billion per month extra. Now, in the extract, it states that one cause is a weaker currency. What you should be thinking here is Wikidec. Weak pound, imports dear, exports cheap. So a weak currency would lead to a growth in the international competitiveness of our economy. What it does, it makes our exports cheaper for foreign countries to buy. So if these are now more price competitive, then it should in theory boost the demand for them. And we can see that's happened from the extract. We can also link this to something we've been looking at in theme 4. We've got here a worsening terms of trade. So what it in effect means is that when we export a particular basket of exports, we can now buy fewer imports than what we could do before. But the main thing to focus on here is exports cheaper. So the demand for them will increase. Another reason which is given is the global economic recovery. Now you've got to think about what this means. If incomes are growing across the world, then their demand for foreign goods and services will increase. So a bit like in Britain, we've got a marginal propensity to import. Well, so have people across the world. So as incomes grow in China, America, in Europe, etc., and amongst our main trading partners, then that will increase their incomes. And as their incomes start to grow, their demand for UK exports will also start to increase. So more people will buy Land Rover or Jaguar cars made in Great Britain. More people might come on holiday to the UK. So this would bolster the demand for UK exports overseas. Right, now we understand why exports have increased by this roughly 4.5 to £5 billion per month. What we can now do is start to think about our answer. So you've got here what I'd expect to see in a top level 3 answer. So remember, what we're looking at here is the knowledge, the application, and the analysis. We've got to explain how the change in the value of exports since mid-2016 has impacted on UK economic growth. So what I'm going to say first of all is that this growth of exports by roughly, and I'm going to change this number again now, by roughly £4.5 billion per month would lead to an outward shift in aggregate demand. And that is because the formula for aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Okay, so I've got this growth in aggregate demand, this outward shift in AD. Now, hopefully what you can see from that diagram now is that as AD moves outwards, you're going to have a growth in GDP from Y1 to Y2. So straight away, I can demonstrate to the examiner that we're going to get this actual economic growth. Now, another really, really good key word to bring here that would be is an export-led growth strategy. So a growth in exports would mean there's a growing demand for UK goods and services across the world, and that would mean that UK businesses have to respond by producing more output. The growth in output being produced will therefore create a growth in real GDP across the economy. I've got that really clear, effective link. Now, I could also now be really, really clever. At the top of the page, I've got this quote from the extract. It is a significant driver of growth in the economy. Remember what we said, this £4.5 billion per month growth is over £50 billion a year. This could add over 2% per year to UK GDP. So I'm now making that judgment. It could be quite a significant impact on UK GDP. I could link it now to how it could improve net trade performance and therefore increase UK's GDP even further. What I could also do, though, I could link it to how it could reduce cyclical unemployment and create even more economic growth. So, for example, if you've got a growing demand for output across the economy, UK firms have to demand more labour. Well, that will reduce demand-deficient unemployment and therefore create more jobs across the economy and raise wage rates. And then I could be really clever now and say, well, if wage rates are growing and more people are working, it could create a growth in consumption. It could raise animal spirits and lead to more investment taking place. And this would lead to another increase in aggregate demand. And I can now see that these multiplier effects are creating additional rounds of economic growth across the economy. So if I put all these different things that I've said together, I've demonstrated really good understanding of this question, and I've got a level 3 answer. So let me give you the paragraph that I would say here. I'd say, well, overall, we can see from the extract that exports, which remember are goods made in our economy but sold overseas, have increased by approximately £4.5 billion per month. From the extract, we can say this is going to be a significant driver of economic growth. This is because as exports increase, then aggregate demand will increase. And this is because exports are a positive contributor towards our aggregate demand. As the demand for UK output starts to grow, then firms have to respond by producing more output. This will clearly lead to a growth in GDP from Y1 to Y2. This could then create multiplier effects across the economy. Growing demand for output will create a growing demand for workers, which will tackle unemployment problems and therefore raise wage rates due to growing demand for labour. As incomes start to increase across the economy, there'll therefore be additional expenditure which will take place, which will further raise aggregate demand and therefore GDP across the economy. I've got all the ammunition that I need there to get full marks for that first paragraph. What I've now got to think about is evaluation. Now this looks a little bit messy, so I'm just going to try and break up some of these different points a little bit. And for some reason, it's not letting me write on the iPad, so what we'll have to do is to base it off of these different stars that I've put. Let's try one more time, see if it'll let me do it now. Nope, it's been a bit temperamental, so we'll have to give that one a miss. Let's try one thing. Nope, it's not having it. Right, so it's worth remembering, everyone, for evaluation, that all I'm really looking for is one developed point. One point explained in detail is far better than listing me several different evaluative statements. So I would only give one of these several stars that I've put down here, but I'd need to explain it and link it back to the question. So look at the first one that I've put down. I could say that a growth in exports will clearly contribute towards the growth in GDP. But how significant that growth in aggregate demand will be will partly depend on the other components of aggregate demand. I could say, for example, consumption and government spending are much more significant components of aggregate demand. So changes in consumption and investment, and maybe even government spending, will have a much more significant impact on GDP than what a growth in exports would be. Look at that second point that I've put down. I could say, well, overall, that this growth in exports could add well over 2% to UK GDP. But we don't know how significant this is because we don't know from the extract what is happening to imports. We could say that, if imports are growing at the same time as exports are increasing, then the growth in imports might wipe out the benefits of this growth in exports. Well, that could therefore weaken the improvement in trade performance and therefore limit the growth in AD and therefore limit the growth in GDP. The third one shows a wonderful link back to the extract now. I could say, well, overall, we could say that one of the big drivers behind this growth in exports is a weak currency. Well, what we know is that currencies don't tend to remain low or high for very long. They tend to fluctuate quite significantly. So what we don't know at this moment in time is how long the UK currency will remain weak. So as the currency starts to appreciate again, we could see future export growth start to come down. And then that kind of builds in with my next point a little bit as well. We can already see that export growth has started to stagnate. It's been stuck, if I go back to the data, at below £50 billion for the bulk of 2017. So that original growth does seem to have levelled off a little bit. So if this starts to reverse, then the benefits for economic growth of this growth in exports may start to deteriorate. Now, the last one I put at the bottom is a really clever one if you can include something like this. What we know is the growth in exports has been achieved mainly by the weaker currency. And then think back to WIPIDET. It doesn't just make exports cheap, but it also raises import costs. It means that for firms in the UK that want to use the global supply chain, well, their cost of production will now increase. Well, that could therefore shift inwards the short run aggregate supply curve, and that could take away some of the benefits of that growth in exports. It could limit that growth in GDP. I could also say, that for UK people, we might be quite price inelastic for lots of our imports. So what that could therefore mean then is that spending on imports actually starts to go up as the currency gets weaker. But I've now got to link it back to exports. This could therefore mean that spending on imports might increase by more than what spending on exports has done by. And this would again limit that growth in GDP. So guys, just to reiterate the message for evaluation, we develop one point in detail, but it must have a link back to the question. So in my evaluation, it must have a link back to how will this affect that growth in exports and GDP? How will it limit it, etc.? So take one of these points and develop it in detail. Right, anyway, we will stop there. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you for the next video soon.